Chris. Thanks as always. Let's start where Trudy started, and that's on the Middle East. I'm really interested in what you think about, well, two things. One, the USA getting more involved with the THAAD missile system and 100 troops on the ground, but at the same time, the State Department saying Israel needs to allow more supplies into Gaza or they'll stop the military aid. It sounds like a hollow threat to me, given at the same time a lot more military support's going in.
It's an enormous amount. And what we have to recognise now is that the United States is already actively engaged in another war in the Middle East. Israel could not actually survive if it wasn't for those air defence systems that the US has provided from its aircraft carriers to start with. There's 2 aircraft carriers rotating through there. It's got a nuclear submarine in the area that's entirely to defend it against Iran, attacks from Iran. Now it's engaged in this. The question is how deeply engaged it gets in this. And you would think that the Israelis are desperate to clean the decks at the moment in Gaza, in Lebanon. There has to be some strife in the West Bank, and they have to settle things with Iran as well, and they can only do all of that with the United States assistance. And I just think we are at an extremely dangerous moment right now as to how deep this goes. And don't forget, we're seeing around the world some of the chess pieces beginning to move. Vladimir Putin met with the Iranian president last week. He talked about the world order being changed. Xi Jinping's spoken about, changes unseen in a century. They both believe that the world order is changing. China and Russia have been in more military operations together this year than in any time in their recent past. Their Air Force did a flyby of Alaskan airspace. North Korean troops are now on the ground, apparently, in Russia and might join the fight. So look at what's happening around the world. I think that Joe Biden, at this point we're at the moment, which will be an election and then Joe Biden in the White House until January, that he is being tested by his allies and his enemies.
Yeah, and a lame duck president, this is a moment as well where Israel obviously feels it's a window, regardless of what happens in November, they are going to make ground regardless.
And how does this end? Like, you think now, the job is not done in Gaza, and both of us agree Israel has the right to defend itself, and that means fighting, and that's going to be extremely unpleasant. And it's very, very hard to watch. But the job isn't done in Gaza. They were going to destroy Hamas. Hamas is not destroyed. They can get the hostages back. They haven't done that. They've now moved into Lebanon. They've been into Lebanon 3 times before this, and it didn't end well in those times. So what's it going to do now? Clear all of the ground in front of it, try to create a buffer zone there? Does it occupy Gaza in future? Does it need to be more engaged in the West Bank? Does it need to occupy that land in Lebanon? How does Israel now extract itself from the fight that it's in? I think that this is a question that is almost imponderable. I don't know how you get out of the circumstances that Israel now finds itself in. This is an existential fight.
Oh, and one without end by the looks of it. On the US election, you touched on that, and Joe Biden, has only got a few months left in the job, but every podcast or expert I listen to, one says it's favouring Trump, one says it's favouring Harris. Either way, I think the consistent view is this is so close 3 weeks out.
And you have to imagine that it's going to be a very, very close result. Polls usually, and we can never predict the future game based on the last one, but in the past they have underestimated Trump. So chances are he's a little bit further ahead in the polls than it might look. But look, I think the worst possible outcome for the United States would be essentially a tie or something approaching a tie, and neither major party accepting the result of the election. Don't forget that Al Gore did accept the results when it was very close and went down to Florida. That was gracious on his behalf. Trump did not. Imagine a circumstance where the United States was essentially in a tie and Congress had to vote on who the president was going to be.
Wow, it's not that hard to imagine, is it?
No, and it's terrifying.
It is terrifying. And then on the another election that doesn't look as close, it's a lot closer to home, and that's Queensland. Stephen Miles is throwing everything at it, bar the kitchen sink, including promising a plebiscite on nuclear energy if he were to win. It doesn't, from what I've heard from Ann Toomey and other constitutional experts, it doesn't matter what the states might do in terms of plebiscites. If the federal government wants to push ahead with it, they can.
Yeah, they can. In the end, though, it's like all of these things. There has to be negotiation with the state as to where these things are going to go. And I think the most likely place actually would be South Australia. I think that you might find behind the scenes that Peter Malinauskas recognises that in the long run, for a state like South Australia, they're going to have that kind of, well, dispatchable power. And I'll draw one last point on this. If the cost
He's previously been quite positive about it.
He has, and I think that he would recognise the fact that if more wind and solar on a grid means lower electricity prices, why does South Australia have the highest residential electricity prices in Australia when it has more wind and solar on its grid, around about 80% of its generation, than anywhere else in Australia? And that is because putting more wind and solar on a grid does not bring down the price of power, because that's not how it's set. It's set by the highest cost of generation. South Australia at peak times, that's always going to be gas.
Chris Uhlmann, talk to you next week.
Thanks, mate.